Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hey everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you so much for joining me for the thrilling conclusion of this rip-roaring, rollicking, murder and robbery epic saga of romance, love, and violence. Yes, the story of Bonnie and Clyde that we have been exploring together over the past 3 weeks. I sure have enjoyed the heck out of story time with my friends, I'll tell you that, and I hope that you have too. And yes, when I mention 3 weeks, you know what that means. That means that this, the thrilling finale, is also part 7 of Kinda Murdery's Bonnie and Clyde story. So, if you haven't heard parts 1 through 6 yet, I don't recommend starting a book from the last page. Although some people love to do it, nothing against them. If that's your thing, go for it. If not, go on back, get caught up, and then come back and join us. Alright, the show's a little bit longer than usual today, so I don't want to loiter. Buckle up, strap on your Doc Martens, and head for the mosh pit as we immerse ourselves in the inside story of the killing of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrows, as told by a man who was there on the road where it happened, Sheriff Henderson Jordan from Bienville Parish, Louisiana. It's time to make like beloved Eddie Munson and heavy metal. Kinda Murdery starts now. Early in 1932, when I became sheriff of Bienville Parish, Clyde Barrows was a convict in the Texas State Penitentiary. He was a small-timer then, and on February 2nd of that year, the youthful car thief who was to spread terror and death through a dozen states was released on general parole. The notoriety of the Bloody Barrows gathered momentum. Hardly more than a year following his release, Clyde Barrows and his associates had been identified in 7 murders. Within that short time, the Crimson partnership with Bonnie Parker, pretty, red-haired waitress, had been sealed. As a police officer, I watched with horror the increasing atrocities of the gang. 12 murders in 26 months? 9 of those victims were officers who'd been shot down in battles with this wantonly violent pack of desperados. I rejoiced at the victories won by the law in the other states. Buck Barrows, Clyde's brother, wounded by Missouri officers, died after his capture by the Iowa posse. Blanche Barrows, wife of Buck, now is in the Missouri State Penitentiary. A member of the gang who participated in several of the murders is under death sentence in Texas. Others are in various prisons. From all of this dramatic robbery, murder, and violence, a cold-blooded, heartless criminal combination emerged. Sheriff Henderson Jordan just called Bonnie and Clyde a cold-blooded, heartless criminal combination and referred to Bonnie as Clyde's able lieutenant. And that likely all is true. Bonnie was certainly able. She was far more than some gangster's girlfriend. That being said, it seems to me that the truth lands squarely in Girls Run the World. What this story suggests to me is that Clyde was just as much Bonnie's able lieutenant, if not more, than the other way around. Perhaps there's more than just linguistic rhythm to the fact that America's most famous killer couple is remembered as Bonnie and Clyde, not Clyde and Bonnie. That's right. Cigar-chomping, aspiring movie star, and certified badass Bonnie Parker was nobody's lieutenant. She strikes me as having been a general officer. A general officer of brutality, banditry, murder, and yes, of course, romance. I mentioned at the very outset of this story in part number 1 that in researching it, I felt that perhaps I had come across the reason why Bonnie and Clyde were so much more famous than Dale Jones and Margie Dean. And it wasn't just the rise of the popularity of the radio, or Bonnie's attractiveness and brightly colored hair, although both of those things were probably part of it. It's that Bonnie and Clyde were a hot mess. You never knew what was coming next. They were the best dramatic television show, the best, wildest reality show, if you want to think of it like that, in America. Now, Dale Jones and Margie Dean, they were largely extremely careful. They planned big heists. They kept as a commandment never to kill anyone unless absolutely necessary. They were a well-run, well-oiled unit. And so, in many ways, as incredible as their story is, they were far less dramatic. I mean, what do we know about reality TV? Reality TV shows are never about super functional, responsible families. No, they're about train wrecks, dumpster fires, and hot messes, right? Well, Bonnie and Clyde, they weren't planning inflation-adjusted $1 million train heists. They were running from the law like their hair was on fire, robbing gas stations willy-nilly, often for loose change, and killing anyone that got in their way. I mean, to their credit, they generally didn't kill people just to kill them, as you've heard. They let people go when they could, but compared to Dale Jones and Margie Dean, my goodness, Bonnie and Clyde were a veritable fountain of death. And they might kill you because you tried to step between them and $5, not 5,000. In other words, their unpredictability, combined with their general attractiveness, the radio, the romance, combined with the cigar-chomping woman who was most likely, though the people chronicling the story didn't want to say it, the leader of the gang, all of these things made them incredibly compelling, as they still are. And that, more than just the radio, is the reason why I think they are so much more famous than Dale Jones and Margie Dean. Alright, let's get back to the story of Sheriff Henderson Jordan from Bienville Parish, Louisiana. We'll pick it up at what he called a cold-blooded, heartless criminal combination and what we call a killer couple. The viciousness of Clyde Barrow and his able lieutenant, Bonnie Parker, surpassed even that of John Dillinger, who was rated as public enemy number 1. Like countless other peace officers in the South and the Southwest, I had attempted to visualize some plan to end the wild career of the pair. Never had I actually believed, however, that such an opportunity would occur in my quiet parish. Bienville Parish is in the northwest part of Louisiana. Arcadia, the parish site, which is in the northeast part of the parish, is about 80 miles east of the Texas-Louisiana line. The greater part of the parish lies to the southwest of Arcadia. Geographically, this would have placed my parish, and again this is Sheriff Henderson Jordan from Bienville speaking, well within the reach of the swooping dashes of the killers. But until the bombastic end of their sadistic story, only one crime had been charged to Barrow and his gang in Louisiana. That one crime occurred on the night of April 27, 1933, when H.D. Darby, a Ruston undertaker, and Miss Sophie Stone, home demonstration agent, were kidnapped by Barrow and later released in central Arkansas. Ruston is about 25 miles east of Arcadia. The afternoon of March 24, 1934, one of my deputies informed me that 2 men wished to speak to me. The visitors entered my private office. The door was closed. The men were Agent L.A. Kendall of the Division of Investigation, Department of Justice, and Deputy Sheriff Steve Norrid of Bossier Parish. Again, please, I ask you to forgive this Yankee retelling my story both for his flat northern accent and also for all the times he inevitably will mispronounce the name of a place or a person in the great state of Louisiana. So yeah, that's who came to visit me. Agent L.A. Kendall of the Division of Investigation, Department of Justice, and Deputy Sheriff Steve Norrid of Bossier Parish. They were on the trail of Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. "Do you recall the Eastham, Texas prison farm escape last January?" Agent Kendall asked me. "That was the raid in which a guard was killed and 5 convicts were freed." Now, I remembered vividly the daring exploit of Barrow and Bonnie Parker. Raymond Hamilton, who was one of Barrow's earlier criminal companions, Henry Methvin, Joe Palmer, W.H. Bybee, and J.B. French were the convicts delivered in the affair. Major Crowson, the guard, was struck down by a hail of bullets fired from the weapons of the killers. "We've established positively that Henry Methvin has been traveling with Barrow and Bonnie Parker," Agent Kendall said. "Working on the supposition that Methvin might attempt to visit relatives, We've been trying to locate his father, Ivan Methvin. Ivan Methvin lived until recently in Bossier Parish, just west of your parish. He moved some time back. Our information is that he moved to a place about 15 miles north of Coushatta, Red River Parish. Well, that would put him just inside my parish, I said. Down in the southwest corner. Agent Kendall nodded. The visit of the two officers ended 15 minutes later. Before they left, I'd agreed to carry on a quiet investigation. I spent virtually every daylight hour of the following 10 days traveling through the southwestern part of Bienville Parish. I stopped my car to talk to the farmers in the area. At no time did I ever make any reference to the purpose of my trips to the various communities. I talked to merchants and police in the villages of the district. After the first week of the task began to appear hopeless, I spent hours listening to farmers discussing cotton prices, politics, and casual gossip. After the first week, the task began to appear hopeless. I'd spent hours listening to farmers discussing cotton prices, politics, and casual gossip. I'd asked carefully worded questions about neighbors. A new neighbor is an event of importance in a rural community. Finally, I caught a break. I heard the name of Ivan Methvin, the father of Clyde Barrows' cohort, Henry Methvin. Ivan had rented a place in the very tip of the parish, close to where Bienville Parish, Natchitoches, and again, I'm basically a ghost and Zevin is my medium, and so you'll have to forgive him that he has no idea how to pronounce the words that I'm saying. But it's there at the tip of the parish, close to where Bienville Parish, Natchitoches, and Red River Parish meet at a common point. Were Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and Henry Methvin using that piney woods section with its innumerable hiding places as a rendezvous point? I realized that I had just started a difficult and perhaps dangerous undertaking. Perhaps dangerous? That's pretty cavalier. If the killers had been frequenting the vicinity, I knew that one misstep on my part would send them scurrying away. A carefully thought-out plan would need to be devised. I could not then foresee the next development. I regret that I must withhold the name of the person who supplied information of the utmost importance. In order to protect this man, I will not disclose any of the conditions under which we communicated. Now remember, Zevin chiming in here, that Sheriff Jordan is telling this story in November of 1934, not even a year after the death of Bonnie and Clyde, who had lots of family and friends and were very popular among some people. So if he seems to be a little bit cagey in the information he reveals, that's because the danger to allies of the law was very real and immediate. All right, back to Sheriff Jordan. Like I said, I regret that I must withhold the name to protect the man, but all that can really be said is that my informant was on the inside. Of course, I suppose you wouldn't be much of an informant from the outside, now would you? Now, through this informant, this confidential informant, I learned that Barrow, Henry Methvin, and Bonnie Parker had been making periodic visits to the vicinity of the Ivan Methvin farm. The visits had been made at intervals of about 2 weeks. Traveling at night, usually between 10 and 11 o'clock, the outlaws would dash into the area in a fast motor car. An hour or so later, their car would be seen speeding away over narrow side roads. That was in early April 1934, barely 6 months ago. I called Agent Kendall, who was then at Monroe, 53 miles east of Arcadia. Without revealing my information, I urged the federal operative to come to my office immediately. 2 hours later, we were discussing plans for trapping the killers. And by the killers, of course, I mean what Zevin would call the killer couple, Bonnie and Clyde. The federal agent was thoroughly convinced of the genuineness of my inside source of information. April 13th was the date for the next visit. Long-distance calls were placed for Chief of Police D.D. Baser of Shreveport and Sheriff Tom Hughes of Caddo Parish. These officers were asked to bring heavily armed men to Arcadia. Agent Kendall notified his office of the raid plans. Federal officers were to meet at Arcadia and at Ringgold, a town in the Alabama Bend section close to the bandit rendezvous. All of the officers were requested to be at the meeting places at 6 o'clock that evening. As a final precaution, Agent Kendall and I decided to make another check before setting the big posse into action. It was well that we did. Hey everybody, we're back. Thank you for taking a moment to support the brands who support Kinda Murdery. First off, I'd like to give a shout out to listener Brandy Peterson from Snohomish, Washington. Brandy, I know I owe you some Kinda Murdery stickers, full color vinyl stickers. If anybody wants one, reach out to the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com. Brandy, I know I owe you the stickers. I'm sorry I've been so slow. They are coming your way. And you know what, guys? The truth is, it's disingenuous for me to just call Brandy a listener, because what she is, in fact, is a dear, dear family friend. Years ago, when my wife was pregnant with our daughter, and we had to move in the later stages of that pregnancy, Brandy flew to Los Angeles from Washington and helped us move. She's the best friend any family could hope for. So, Brandy, I love you. We love you. Your stickers are coming. Forgive me for taking so long, and please accept my eternal gratitude for your friendship. Speaking of friends, I also would like to shout out my good buddies Brett and Carl, who host the Evil Never Dies podcast, which is a kick-ass podcast about heavy metal and other things, and also, like Kinda Murdery, has a badass skull logo. Brett, Carl, thanks for being good buddies. Thanks for listening to the show, and specifically, Brett, who is a Texan, was kind enough to reach out to me the other day on Instagram, that's at Kinda Murdery on Instagram, to let me know that the town of Montague, Texas, now I had called it Montague, Texas, in my ignorance, is in fact pronounced Montag. So, everybody in Montag, Texas, thank you so much for listening to the show. Sorry I screwed up the name. It wasn't the first time. It won't be the last time that I mispronounce a name. Thank you guys for forgiving me in my infinitely fallible humanity, which brings me to my next point. Please, everyone, let's remember to be kind to each other, to be mindful of the fact that the social media bubble makes us all believe that nobody could possibly feel as disconnected or lonely as we feel, because everybody curates that little window into their lives, even if it's just a tiny little peephole. They make you think that everything is perfect, that you're the only one who's alone and sad and broken and fallible. And of course, that is a lie. We all feel that way all the time, some of us to greater degrees than others, but we all feel lonely, we all feel sad, we all make mistakes, we all have things in our lives that we'd rather not bear to the world. So if there's someone out there who you care about, and they're a human being, it's a pretty safe assumption that they feel lonely pretty regularly. And so what I would suggest, and I started being mindful about doing this after my dear, dear friend from college, Nicholas Tucci, passed away at the start of the pandemic. But if you think about a friend of yours, a family member, somebody you care about, if you think about them, pause and actually reach out to them. Text them. Call them. Because there's a funny thing about the human brain. The brain is able to trick itself into believing that intending to do something or just thinking about doing something is the same as doing it. And so what happens is you intend to donate to charity, you intend to reach out to a friend or a family member or someone else who's in a tough place or someone you just miss. You intend to do it, and all of a sudden, your brain decides that that intention is the same as the action and rewards itself with the dopamine hit that you're looking for doing something good, except you never actually did it. And that's a big part of the problem with social media, right? We see an article about a worthy cause that we support or a problem in the world that needs correcting or action that should be taken, and we comment on it or we like it, and our brain goes, okay, good, you did it. You did the thing. You're a good person. But in fact, you didn't really do anything. So let's apply that to our human relationships as well. And if you think about somebody you care about, reach out to them, because thinking about them is not the same as letting them know that you're thinking about them. Now, I know I always mention in this section, and I will right here, the new free 3-digit number 988, where if you are in acute crisis, you can call to receive immediate counseling from someone who cares for suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, or mental health related issues. So please remember that number, 988. Program it in your phone. Use it if you need it. Please remember that you are loved. But in this case, although it's extremely valuable to reach out and let somebody who may be in a dark place know how much you care about them, how much you want to see them, how important it is that they continue to walk the planet, that's all extremely important. But in this case, I'm not talking about just reaching out to friends or family or people you care about who may be in a dark place or may be vulnerable to descending into a dark place. I'm talking about any friend, family, or loved one that you have, no matter how stable and happy they may seem. If you think about them, text them, call them, let them know you're there. Because in today's world, with so much digital separation between humans, add to that the pandemic and all of this stuff, we're all feeling more disconnected than ever before. And humans are communal creatures. We need to be together. So if you think about someone, reach out in that moment. Don't tell yourself you're gonna do it later, because you might not, and it might be too late. I mentioned at the top here that I started doing this after my dear friend Nick Tucci passed away unexpectedly. Well, here's what happened to me. Nick, wonderful guy, wonderful actor. He shared a birthday, April 3rd, with the legendary actor Marlon Brando. And Nick, who was a tremendously talented actor, was understandably proud of sharing a birthday with an all-time great like Marlon Brando. And so because of this little mnemonic device, and because he was one of my closest friends in life, I always remembered Nick's birthday, April 3rd. And every year, come hell or high water, I would always call him on his birthday. Well, in 2020... just a couple weeks into the pandemic, it was late March, probably the last week of March, and I thought to myself, remember, Zevin, remember to call Nick on April 3rd. We'd known each other since college, we'd been roommates in Los Angeles, just very close friends, more like brothers, for 20 plus years. At this point, I lived in LA, he'd moved back to the East Coast. I hadn't talked to him in a while. I said, remember, April 3rd's coming up, remember to call Nick on his birthday. And it felt like mere seconds after I had that thought, but it was probably a day later that a close mutual friend of ours reached out to me and let me know that Nick Tucci had passed. And of course I was shocked and devastated. This would have been Nick's 39th birthday if he'd had a chance to celebrate it. You don't expect your close friend to pass away at 39. But what I remember thinking first, well, two things. One was that Nick was very passionate about the things that he cared about. He never had a middle of the road or a halfway opinion about anything. He would either love it to the moon or hate it straight to the depths of hell. And one of the things that Nick was very passionate about was Batman, the character of Batman, comic books and movies. And at this point, we all knew that Robert Pattinson, he originally of Harry Potter and Twilight fame, had been cast as the Caped Crusader, the Dark Knight. And if you'd only seen him in Twilight, you might have wondered way back then if that was a good decision or not. Of course, it turned out to be a good decision. And I knew that whether he loved it or hated it, the Robert Pattinson Batman movie, or what Nick probably would have called the Patman movie, whether he loved it or hated it, he would have had an extremely passionate, extremely compelling, well-reasoned diatribe that supported his feelings. And when I heard that he'd passed away, my first thought was, oh no, I'm never going to find out what Nick thinks about Patman. And then my next thought was, if I had just reached out to him, just called him, just texted him, in that moment when I mentally reminded myself to call or text him in a couple weeks, then I might have gotten to talk to him one last time. Those kind of regrets about people you love suck. I hope none of you listening know what that's like. I'm sure many of you do. So yes, if you think about someone you care about, just pause and reach out. It'll mean a lot to them. And whether it's only because you connected with someone you care about, or because you didn't miss the chance to connect with someone you love for the last time, it'll mean a lot to you too. All right, thank you for giving me the space to share that personal story. It's something I've been gnawing on for a long time, and it's an example of the kind of story that I hope we can all share with each other. So if you have a personal story to tell, reach out to me, kindofmurdery@gmail.com or @kindofmurdery on all social media, including now TikTok. Reach out to me and share it, and if you'd just like to share it with me, you can. But if you'd like me to share it with our audience, I will. You don't have to be wise to have wisdom. We've all collected wisdom along the way, and it's likely that things that seem obvious to you have never even occurred to someone else. So please, reach out, share, let's make a connection. And I would be remiss if on this September the 11th, 2022, I failed to remember with deep honor and gratitude the heroes and the victims of that terrible tragedy 21 years ago, and the ultimate sacrifice that they made for us in our place so that we did not have to. To the families and friends of everyone who died that day and in the days that followed, thank you, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that you must carry so much more than your fair share of a pain that belongs to all of us. So thank you, and your family and friends will never be forgotten. All right, it's time to get back to the thrilling conclusion of Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands Romance of Bonnie and Clyde, Part 7, Kinda Murdery, resumes now. Late that afternoon, we left Arcadia in my car to reconnoiter the vicinity of the projected raid. The other officers were to remain at their posts until they heard from us. We drove into Natchitoches Parish. What we learned there came as a bitter disappointment. Something had caused Barrow to postpone his scheduled visit. He would not be there that night. There seemed to be some uncertainty as to the time of his next trip, and for the safety of the innocent, how that was determined must not be revealed. Speeding back to Arcadia, we notified the officers gathered there of the change to the bandits' plans. Slowly, the men gathered their weapons and ammunition, preparing to leave. I addressed the officers. I want to ask you men to say nothing about this affair tonight. This is the first time in 2 years that anything approaching a spot used as a permanent hideout by Barrow has been found. If our plan should leak out, the gang will be scared out of the country. Please, keep it quiet. Please. Perhaps my desire for secrecy was unnecessary, but I will never think so. In that manner, I entered the far-flung search for the killer gang. In the meantime, 2 of the most outstanding officers in the Southwest had been relentlessly following the trail of Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. Their assignment was to bring the desperados in, dead or alive. Of course, the law would prefer alive, but frankly, at this point, there were so many officers of the law and other innocent people dead in the wake of Bonnie and Clyde that we were a little less picky than we might have been otherwise. Captain Frank Hamer, who had made criminal apprehension history as a member of the famous Texas Rangers, had taken up the hazardous task of capturing Bonnie and Clyde soon after the Eastham prison farm delivery. He was a fit man for the assignment. 6 foot 3 inches tall and powerfully built, he possessed the analytical mind necessary to cope with Barrow's elusiveness. Infuriated by the raid on the prison farm, Lee Simmons, general manager of the Texas prison system, declared that the state would be avenged for the indignity. He decided early that there was only one procedure, and that was to put 1 or 2 highly capable officers on the trail and keep them there until they succeeded. Captain Hamer was his immediate choice. The former Texas Ranger, then a member of the Texas State Highway Patrol, was noted for his persistence, ability, and bravery. Called the fastest man on the draw in the state of Texas, Captain Hamer had killed 65 outlaws who had been foolish enough to attempt to kill him. Holy crap. 65? 65 outlaws? And this is presumably not from a mile away with a long-distance precision rifle. I imagine a lot of these were firefights. 65 outlaws. Holy moly. Although the stories about the officer were legion, General Manager Simmons knew that Captain Hamer was close-mouthed, declining even to discuss his past exploits. Barrow would never know that the nemesis of outlaws might someday look at him down the barrel of a deadly revolver. Before approaching Captain Hamer on the subject, Simmons went to Governor M.A. Ferguson. The prison executive outlined his plan. At first it seemed as though technicalities of the law might defeat the plan. Finally, the governor's consent was won. If Captain Hamer wanted the task, he would be given a blanket assignment with permission to leave the state at will. February 10th, 25 days after the prison camp delivery, Captain Hamer became special investigator of the Texas State Prison System. He had obtained an indefinite leave from the Highway Patrol. At that time, the captain's knowledge of Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker was only general. The crimes of the pair and the activities of peace officers against them had been scattered over a wide territory. If there was a modus operandi, an MO, it would seem to be kill and flee. So where to find Barrow? A spot map of the criminal operations of the outlaws would seem to indicate that you could find Barrow anywhere in 500,000 square miles. Anywhere in 500,000 square miles, huh? Easy peasy, right? Captain Hamer knew that his only chance of success lay in a careful study of the Barrow method of operations. The man's early and more recent crimes would have to be analyzed. The most minute details would have to be taken into consideration. The swooping cross-country dashes of the gang might lead to a forecast. In other words, what Captain Frank Hamer had set out to do was to prepare, in effect, a weather map of the Barrow tactics. By accumulating a vast knowledge of the criminal's activities, the officer believed that he might be able to predict a spot at which he would encounter the outlaws. To start with, he had as basic points 9 murders, possibly a score of sizable holdups, and literally countless petty robberies of all sorts. Captain Hamer's first act was to go to the office of Sheriff R.A. Schmid of Dallas County, Texas. The sheriff and his deputies probably were better acquainted with the Barrow depredations than any other officers in the country. There in Dallas, the special investigator was introduced to Deputy Sheriff Bob Alcorn, who some months previously had been given a special assignment on the Barrow case. Sheriff Schmid and Deputy Alcorn had engaged in a wild battle with Barrow and Bonnie Parker in November of 1933. For hours, the 3 officers went over the records on Barrow and his various companions. The bare facts were there. Sheriff Schmid and Deputy Alcorn went into further detail. The hour was late when this important conference was ended. When it was over, the Hamer-Alcorn combination was formed. The 2 officers were to work together indefinitely. It was not so much the crimes committed by the outlaws that interested the officers at this point. They were rather trying to become acquainted with the habits and psychology of the perpetrators. More than 15,000 miles were to be covered by Frank Hamer's team of searchers. Their travels were to carry them through 9 states: Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and into Mississippi and Louisiana before the desperate pair, the killer couple, Bonnie and Clyde, were cornered. Law enforcement learned that Barrow apparently was a strong believer in hunches. The bandit leader would stop his car in one of his mad dashes, backtrack for miles, and again suddenly change his direction. His movements seemingly were without rhyme or reason. Much about the habits of Barrow and his woman companion, that's Bonnie Parker of course, were learned from W.D. Jones, a youthful witness to several of the murders and other crimes who was arrested by Sheriff Schmid late in 1933. And of course you'll remember Jones's story about being picked up by Barrow and traveling with the gang and committing crimes with the gang, and then fleeing the gang and going home to his mother, planning to never be a criminal again, only to have Barrow show up and force him to rejoin. One of the periods that had been a blank to earlier investigators was cleared up by Hamer's team. That was the time that Bonnie and Clyde disappeared following the kidnapping of 2 officers near Wellington, Texas, last year. Bonnie at that time was suffering from severe burns received in a motorcar wreck. After binding the kidnapped officers to a tree in western Oklahoma, the gang dashed across the state and took possession of a home in Veneta, Oklahoma. 2 members of the party went to Miami, a nearby town, Miami, Oklahoma, and secured the services of a nurse. The nurse was instructed to go to Afton. There she was picked up and taken by motorcar to the Veneta house. For several days, the nurse was kept prisoner by Clyde Barrow. The young woman was forced to treat Bonnie Parker's burns. Still badly frightened by her experiences, the nurse told her story for the first time to Captain Hamer and Deputy Alcorn. A rapid succession of new atrocities starting in late March and continuing into April 1934 caused the officers to speed madly over hundreds of miles of highways. There were 2 bank robberies in which Clyde Barrow and Raymond Hamilton were identified. Then, April 1st, Easter Sunday, public sentiment against Barrow and his cigar-chomping best gal was brought to a white heat by the murder of 2 state highway patrolmen. The officers were brutally killed near Grapevine between the cities of Dallas and Fort Worth. L.G. Ferris, head of the patrol, immediately offered all of his resources, all of the men in his organization, to Captain Hamer and Deputy Alcorn. Captain Hamer chose just one man, Patrolman M.B. Galt, who had been a member of the Rangers. The pursuers were given further powers and resources by a secret action of the Dallas County Grand Jury. There's a pretty entertaining, pretty darn good movie, if you like the kind of movies that I like. This is Zevin butting in here, of course, called The Highwaymen, starring Kevin Costner and Woody Harrelson, with Costner playing Frank Hamer and Woody Harrelson playing M.B. Galt, about the capture of Bonnie and Clyde. By the way, that was an entirely unpaid, honest, and contemporaneous endorsement and plug for the movie The Highwaymen, which is a Netflix original movie, by the way. I'm not getting a dime from Netflix to plug their movies. However, Netflix, if you're listening and you would like to sponsor Kinda Murdery, well, that would be awesome. That's right. Kinda Murdery is available to be sponsored by any product that doesn't somehow demagnetize our moral compass. So if you like the show, reach out and sponsor us. In the meantime, everybody do watch The Highwayman. It's great. And that's something I am not being sponsored to say. Back to the story. 5 days later, Bonnie and Clyde killed Constable Cal Campbell at Commerce, Oklahoma. In their escape, they kidnapped Chief of Police Percy Boyd, releasing the officer hours later in Kansas. It was then that Attorney General Homer S. Cummings ordered the Department of Justice to make every effort toward apprehension of Barrow and his companions. Then followed days of running down tip after tip on the whereabouts of the killers. Traveling sometimes separately but more often together, the three officers, Captain Frank Hamer, Deputy Alcorn, and Patrolman M.B. Galt, sped all over the Southwest. At times, they knew they were close on the trail. On several occasions, they believed it would be just a matter of hours before the gang would be cornered. But law enforcement all over the country, a number of times that I can no longer even count, believed that exact same thing at so many points throughout this incredible story of escape and murder and banditry and escape and murder and banditry. Rinse, repeat. That is the epic tale of the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde, which we are rapidly approaching the climax. So yes, at times the officers believed that the gang would soon be cornered within a matter of hours. Traveling sometimes separately but more often together, the three officers, Captain Frank Hamer, Deputy Alcorn, and Patrolman M.B. Galt, sped all over the Southwest. At times they knew they were close on the trail. On several occasions they believed it would be just a matter of hours before the gang would be cornered. Raymond Hamilton was captured on May 25th. He was fleeing from Louisville, where he'd robbed the First National Bank. Hamilton told the officers that his association with Barrow had been terminated some weeks previously. The gang had quarreled over the division of loot from a bank at Lancaster, Texas. The split had occurred at Terre Haute, Indiana, or Terre Haute, or Terre Haute. If you're from Indiana, please reach out, kindamurdery@gmail.com, and correct me. The split had occurred at Terre Haute, Indiana. When Hamilton escaped, he was serving sentences totaling 263 years. One of the sentences was for a murder in which he had participated with Clyde Barrow. The killer was rushed to trial on one of the bank robbery cases. The state demanded the death sentence. A jury gave him another 99-year sentence, bringing the total to 362 years. This was the second time that Hamilton had escaped the extreme penalty asked by the state. Although disappointed by the verdict, state officials announced that they were not through with the young slayer. He would be tried for the murder of Major Crowson at the prison farm. Numerous letters mailed by the outlaws gave the officers additional information on the movements of their quarry. In one, Bonnie Parker denied that she smoked cigars. The final letter, mailed to Hamilton, was received May 15th. Barrow called his former partner a killer and a yellow punk. He accused Hamilton of attempting to take more than his share of the bank loot. A fingerprint on the letter was identified as that of Clyde Barrow by Douglas Walsh, identification expert of the Dallas Police Department. The print was identified by at least 20 specific points. Gradually, Captain Hamer, Deputy Alcorn, and Patrolman Galt were closing in on the remaining members of the gang. At last, they had determined that Barrow was shuttling back and forth between points near Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Shreveport, Louisiana. In fact, the night of April 13th, a trap was laid for Barrow at Fort Smith. This was the same night that Barrow had failed to appear at his hideout in Bienville Parish. It was believed that the gang barely had escaped capture in the Arkansas raid. Underworld contacts in several cities were utilized. That the officers solved 14 bank robberies while in pursuit of Barrow indicates the thoroughness of which they worked. Although a glass half empty kind of person might say that the fact that they had time to solve 14 bank robberies before capturing Bonnie and Clyde showed how incredibly ineffectively and inefficiently they had worked, at least at the goal of capturing the famed outlaws. Shortly after the date that my raid had failed to materialize, and when I say my, I'm Sheriff Henderson Jordan from Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Shortly after my raid failed to materialize, Captain Hamer and Deputy Alcorn dashed into Shreveport, a city about 60 miles west of Arcadia. In a conference call there with Sheriff Hughes, the Texas officers were advised to call on me. Sheriff Hughes did not divulge the nature of my information. A few hours later, I had made the acquaintance of the Texans. Seated in my office at Arcadia, they listened closely as I related the details of my investigation. They asked numerous questions about the lay of the land. Finally, Captain Frank Hamer said, "Well, that's the best darn information we've had on 'em. It looks like you might have a fine chance of catching 'em. We'd like to work with you if you don't mind." It should go without saying that I was more than glad to accept the offer of Captain Hamer. We talked for some time. In the exchange of information, I learned much about the killers, profiting from the arduous work of the men trailing the Barrow gang. Assuming the rumors of the presence of the Texas officers might reach the ear of Barrow, it was agreed that Captain Hamer should return to his home in Austin, and that Deputy Alcorn would return to Dallas. They would await my call before returning to Louisiana. I immediately contacted my undercover man. We made plans for a cautious watch over the vicinity of the Methvin farm. Too late, I learned of another visit to the place by Barrow, Henry Methvin, and Bonnie Parker. It occurred the night of May 8th. The report I received on that visit was so detailed that it revealed a little of Barrow's conversation. He'd gone to bed at 1 in the morning, sleeping only 2 hours. Here's what infamous crook and killer Clyde had to say. "I slept in a bed for the first time in 8 months. Barrows said. The report of this snippet of conversation reached me several hours after the 3 members of the gang had sped away in their motor car. Believing that there might be some chance of capturing Barrow alive some night when he was taking one of those naps, I made arrangements for speedier communication with my informant. In many respects, I dreaded the thought of such a night raid, as it would endanger the lives of several women and children. However, it appeared as if the risk might be necessary. In order that Captain Hamer and Deputy Alcorn might become acquainted with the country, I asked them to come to Arcadia. We drove over most of the roads in the southwestern part of the parish. I described the surrounding country. Before that trip had been completed, the officers were thoroughly familiar with every possible avenue of escape. "I don't like the idea of a raid," I told the Texans. "I'm sure I can think of some way of us avoiding it. Give me a little more time and we may be able to take them without killing or wounding innocent persons." The officers offered no objection. They returned to their homes. The morning of May 9th, I called Captain Hamer. He arrived at my office at 6 o'clock in the evening. He was accompanied by Deputy Alcorn, Patrolman Galt, and Deputy Ted Hinton of Dallas County. "We're about ready to go," I said. "Sometime between now and the 1st of the month, Barrow and Bonnie Parker will be at the hideout. Just now, the date is uncertain. Will you be ready to come when I call?" There was no doubt about the response. Captain Hamer agreed to stay at a designated hotel in Shreveport. He would be ready to leave on a minute's notice. The other officers would be likewise prepared for action. About a week later, Ivan Methvin moved. Not moved figuratively like made an action in this overall caper. He literally moved houses, moved homes. What would that do to our plans? A tedious wait was ended by word from my informer. He'd been able to maintain his contact. Barrow had paid a visit to Methvin's new location. Methvin had moved from the tip of Bienville Parish to an abandoned house east of Sales. This house, the property of S.G. Cole of Sales, was located about 18 miles southwest of Arcadia and somewhat near the center of my parish. Situated deep in a forest of pine trees, the house was 1.25 miles off of State Highway number 416. The road leading to the house was winding, barely wide enough to accommodate a slowly moving car. It was lined with tall trees. Several hundred yards from the highway, the road passed through a clearing about 400 yards long. From there onto the house, the lane wound its way through the forest and across a draw. In a surprise twist, the house was occupied by Methvin without the permission of the owner. My next information concerning Barrow was of a startling nature. Late Monday night, May 21st, word came to me that Barrow and Bonnie were planning a raid on the First National Bank at Arcadia. Barrow's setup for such a robbery was almost perfect. He could have raided the bank and 25 minutes later have literally dropped from sight in his new hiding place. He would not have had to use a main highway in his escape. Early the next morning, I warned WMDs, president of the bank, of Barrow's plot. WMDs? Alright, I have to say this. Just for all the kids today, and back when I was a kid too. WMDs? WMDs nuts! Sorry. Alright, so I warned the bank owner of the plot. I lent the banker a high-powered rifle and placed armed men in strategic positions in the vicinity of the institution. A constant guard was to be maintained during the business hours of the bank. It was 8:30 Tuesday night, May 22nd, that I received another report from my undercover man. The import of that whispered message was staggering. It meant an immediate formulation of a new plan. If I could move fast enough, it meant that Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker would drive into an inescapable trap. Clyde Barrow, Henry Methvin, and Bonnie Parker had visited the old coal place near Sales Monday night. The following morning, Clyde, Bonnie, and the escaped convict drove to Shreveport. Their car was parked in a secluded spot. Methvin started off on foot to obtain food for himself and his companions. Something had alarmed Barrow. No one will ever know what caused him to drive away before Methvin returned. I learned that an hour or so later he returned to the place but had been unable to find Methvin. Alarmed over the separation from Henry, Barrow and Bonnie returned to the coal place. They arrived there between 5 and 6 o'clock. They soon learned that Methvin had not returned to his father's home. Barrow gave an order to Ivan Methvin, Henry's father. "Now you go to the old place and see if Henry's there," the outlaw commanded. "We'll go to Bossier Parish. He may have gone there." I was to learn later that the gang had a meeting place in that parish between the towns of Benton and Plain Dealing. The vital part of my informer's message was yet to come. His voice lower than ever, he quoted Barrow.
"We'll meet you on the road between Sales and Gippsland, between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning,"
the outlaw told the elder Methvin. Could we trap Barrow on the highway? I rushed to the telephone and called Captain Hamer. My message was short. "Come to Arcadia at once. Get your other men if you can." There was no time to be lost. We'd have to select a place for the trap, a place distant from homes. I knew it would be difficult to find a desirable clearing along the Gippsland-Sales road. A forest-lined road would have offered too good an opportunity for the pair to escape. The tentative plan for the trap was made in my office. Besides myself, there were 5 others in the room. Captain Hamer, Chief Deputy Sheriff Prentice M. Oakley of Bienville Parish, Deputy Sheriffs Alcorn and Hinton of Dallas County, and Patrolman Galt. About 11 o'clock, I took Captain Hamer and Deputy Alcorn in my car to Gippsland, a little town southwest of Arcadia. For the next 2 hours, we drove back and forth over the sandy graveled road between Gippsland and Sales. Our plan made it necessary to establish the trap somewhat closer to Sales than Gippsland. Methvin would be driving north over the highway, and we wanted him to be the first to arrive at the trap. At last, we found what seemed to be a perfect spot. It was about 3 miles north of Sales and situated on a straight north and south stretch of highway. The road swung down a fairly sharp grade over a small rise and then to a steeper hill. The place for our ambush was on the rise. The road cut through the small hill to leave an embankment of about 3 feet in height on both sides. The forest receded at the point, and the sides of the road were lined with low brush. In throwing back the earth from the cut, the highway workers had created a low ridge along the east embankment. Grass and weed along the edge made a perfect cover. From behind the ridge could be obtained a good view of the road to the north. We could see the road for 3/4 of a mile to the north and a full half-mile to the south. Would Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker keep the appointment with Ivan Methvin? That was all that was vital to us. We'd be ready for them. We returned to Arcadia to pick up the other officers. Shortly before 3 o'clock the morning of May 23rd, our posse of 6 men left Arcadia in 2 motor cars. Less than an hour later, we were squatting in the dew-soaked brush and weeds at the trap. Our cars were hidden deep in the brush. I had arranged the men in a line about 40 yards long, all on the east side of the road. Deputies Alcorn and Hinton were at the north end of the line. They would be better able to identify Barrow and Bonnie Parker than other members of our group. Captain Frank Hamer, because of his accuracy with firearms, was stationed at the south end. I was near the center of the line. Chief Deputy Oakley was at my right, and Patrolman Galt to my left. Deputy Hinton was armed with a Browning automatic rifle. Deputy Alcorn, Captain Frank Hamer, and Patrolman Galt were armed with automatic shotguns loaded with buckshot. Deputy Oakley and I were carrying Remington automatic rifles, and there was a third rifle of that type available for use. All of us, of course, were carrying our regular sidearms. Chilled by the dew, we were glad when the sun rose over the trees. All of us were hungry. The next meal was the principal topic of discussion, and we talked about food to lessen the monotony. Barrows seldom was mentioned. Attacks by swarms of mosquitoes did not make the wait easier. At about daylight, I called to Deputy Hinton. "How are the groceries holding out, Ted?"
"What groceries? I's so hungry I've eaten the stock off your rifle and I'm starting on the barrel."
Our plan was to stop Methvin as he drove along the road. We would force him to park on the side of the highway awaiting the appearance of Barrow and Bonnie Parker. We wanted to capture them alive if possible. There would be no chance of that if we tried to stop their car as it sped over the road. Barrow was known to be a fast driver. A barricade would have spoiled any chance we might have at avoiding bloodshed. The sound of a motor came from the south. Instantly, all members of the group dropped to reclining positions in the undergrowth. A truck pulled over the hill. It appeared familiar to me. As it drew closer, I recognized the driver. When it was about 50 yards from the trap, I stepped into the road and signaled the driver to stop. He was Ivan Methvin, Henry Methvin's father, Henry being the current 3rd member of Bonnie and Clyde's gang. As the truck pulled to a halt, the other officers stood up. Methvin looked at them.
"What's the trouble, officers?"
he asked. "We've got a trap set for Barrow and Bonnie Parker, Methvin," I said. "We're going to take 'em right where you meet 'em on the road. Right here is where the meeting is going to take place." If Methvin had any objection to the idea, he didn't put it into words. He pulled his truck over to the west side of the road, still headed north. It stood directly across the highway from Deputies Alcorn and Hinton. "Pull off that right front wheel," I instructed him. "I want you to give the effect that you have a flat tire. Barrow will stop when he sees you." I told Methvin to stand beside his truck. I called the officers together. "We're ready," I said. "There's only one thing more. Don't start anything until it's absolutely certain that Barrow and his woman are in any car that may pull up. Maybe we can take them alive, but I don't believe we ought to take any chances. If they reach for their guns, you let them have it." As the hour of 9 o'clock approached, the strain increased. 2 or 3 cars flashing down the highway from the north caused added tenseness as we awaited the word from Deputies Hinton and Alcorn. For each of those cars, they shouted, "No!" At 9:15, a car nosed over the north hill and started down the grade. At the distance, we could tell it was a Ford V8. It was the type of car that Barrow was driving, according to my informant. As it drew closer, we could distinguish its color as light tan. That also checked out with my informant. Traveling at a pace of about 45 miles an hour, it rapidly was cutting down the distance. The driver apparently saw Methvin. The car began to slow down. Deputy Alcorn, crouching, peered through the weeds. His rifle was in his right hand. His left hand was stretched out behind him, ready to emphasize a signal.
"It's Barrow!"
he called.
"The Parker woman's with him!"
The car was about 100 yards away, traveling at a much slower speed. The occupants, looking at Methvin, apparently felt safe. The first warning had sent a vibration up my spine. As the time neared where life or death hinged on split-second action, the taut feeling passed. I was ready. I could see most of the other men in the posse. None showed the slightest trace of nervousness. "Bob," I called. "Be sure, man," Deputy Alcorn replied. His words barely were audible.
"I know. It's Barrow and his woman. Steady now."
A heavy rumble from the south caused me to look in that direction. A wood pulp truck was approaching at a fair rate of speed. 2 black men were in the cab. It seemed as though the truck might present a shield for the Barrow car. Then, the truck slowed down to a crawling speed. Evidently, the driver feared a collision. The Ford sedan came to a halt between my men and Methvin's Chevrolet truck.
"Hello, got a flat?" Barrow called.
"Yes," Methvin replied. "Did you find Henry?"
"No, haven't you seen him?"
Clyde Barrow was under the wheel of the car. Bonnie Parker was sitting beside him. I observed thankfully that no one was in the rear seat. Methvin continued the conversation by answering Barrow's question in the negative. He then spoke to Bonnie.
"Hey, have you got that drink for me?"
There was no answer to that question. Had it been a signal? I jumped to my feet and shouted,
"Put him up, Clyde, you're covered!"
The big tan V8 leapt forward. Barrow had shifted into low gear as he was talking to Methvin. I was watching Barrow. His left hand was on the steering wheel. He picked up a gun with his right hand. Bonnie Parker was seen to raise a pistol. Then the door on Barrow's side of the car started to swing open. Barrow would not surrender. The sharp report of a rifle sounded. Its echo was drowned by the roar of 6 guns. Lead was poured into Barrow's car. The windshield was shattered. Most of the bullets were taking effect there and in the left front door of the sedan. The car continued to move. Gunfire was raking it from 6 angles. The glass in the rear left door was blown to bits. I saw black holes appear in the side of the car. The noise was deafening. I had no idea of time. It might have been an hour that I stood there on the firing line, but actually, everything was over in seconds. I saw Barrow's head fall against the back of the seat. Blood was gushing out. I saw Bonnie Parker slump forward as if to pick up something off the floor of the car. The motor of the Ford had died. Still in gear, the car coasted jerkily. It rolled into a ditch on the west side of the road, coming to a stop against the side of the embankment. There was no sign of movement inside the car. All of us leapt onto the graveled road and ran to the stalled machine. Our weapons were ready, but even then, we knew that we could discard our guns. Nothing could have lived through that volley of more than 150 shots. Clyde Barrow was dead. Bonnie Parker, her head between her knees, was dead. They'd been unable to fire a shot. I looked down the road at the wood pulp truck. It had stopped at the first shot. The 2 men who'd occupied the cab had fled into the timber. The back of Barrow's head literally had been beaten into a pulp by the hail of lead. He'd been struck at least a dozen times in the body. 6 or 7 bullets had taken effect in Bonnie Parker's face. We later found that she'd been struck by 25 shots. Her right hand virtually was cut off. Both of the outlaws had been cut badly by flying glass. In the lap of Clyde Barrow was a sawed-off 16-gauge automatic shotgun. His right hand was curled around the shortened stock. 7 grim notches had been carved in the wood by the killer. Boy, leaving Sheriff Jordan for a second, Zevin here, as terrible of murderers and criminals as Bonnie and Clyde were, it's hard, right? Somehow to be gunned down in an ambush against such overwhelming odds, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel fair, even though they absolutely deserve justice. Somehow stacking the deck like that doesn't feel like justice, right? I mean, that was my initial reaction. I have to say, though, that the report that Clyde had carved 7 notches into the stock of his automatic shotgun, one for each person that shotgun had killed, does do something to alleviate the sense of foul play or unfair play, stacked deck, rigged rules, whatever you want to call it. 7 notches in the shotgun, one for each human life it's taken, does a pretty effective job of reminding us who law enforcement was actually dealing with. Not so much the romantic figures, the killer couple, but really cold-blooded murderers. All right, back to the story. 7 grim notches had been carved in the wood of the shotgun stock by the killer. In Bonnie's lap was a .45 caliber automatic pistol. There were 3 notches on this gun. Between the pair was another automatic shotgun. So they were both keeping a proud tally of their murders. Whew, yikes. On the floor of the car was a bag containing 40 clips for a Browning automatic rifle. 3 rifles of that type were in the rear of the car. All were loaded. Under a robe on the rear seat were 10 automatic pistols and 1 revolver, all fully loaded. 3 bags and a box contained more than 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Make no mistake, Clyde Barrow and the red-headed Bonnie had been ready for us or any other officers that might have accosted them. We gave them a chance to surrender. They refused. 6 Texas and Louisiana officers are alive today because they shot first and shot fast and shot straight. While we were examining the car and the bodies of its occupants, Ivan Methvin replaced the wheel on his truck and drove away. A few minutes later, telegraph and telephone wires were carrying the news of our success. Boy, success, while accurate, is a tough thing to call it when you've literally ripped them to shreds with bullets and glass. Sheriff Jordan remained at the scene while Captain Hamer and Deputy Alcorn drove to Gibbsland to report to Texas officials. Chief Deputy Oakley notified Coroner J.L. Wade of the killing. Coroner Wade ordered the bodies moved to Arcadia. The tan Ford sedan, which we later learned had been stolen from a resident of Topeka, Kansas, was towed to the parish site. It served as a hearse for Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker on that 18-mile ride. In Arcadia, a closer examination was made of the contents of the outlaw car. 15 sets of license plates under a rear seat indicated one of Barrow's favorite tricks to elude capture. A pair of sunglasses that had been worn by the bandit were found on the seat. The lenses had been shattered by the bullets. Bonnie's overnight case was in the rear of the car. It contained lipstick, rouge, face powder, and various personal effects. Also in the rear of the car was a saxophone and several sheets of music. In the trunk on the back of the machine was a bag containing Barrow's extra clothing, a hot water bottle, and 2 magazines. At the time of her death, Bonnie was wearing a red dress and red shoes. She was wearing a wedding ring, but that must have been one of the very few concessions to appearances ever made by Bonnie. She was not married to Barrow. On Barrow's person was found more than $500. The young killer was dressed in blue trousers and a white shirt. His tie, hanging on the rearview mirror, had been shredded by bullets. He died with his shoes off. They were on the floor of the car. We were compelled to lock the car in the jail yard. Souvenir hunters threatened to tear the machine to pieces. The streets around the jail and the Conger funeral parlor where the bodies were taken were jammed by the curious. The population of Arcadia was multiplied by 4 times within a few hours. After arriving in Arcadia, I informed state authorities of the successful trap. An hour or so later, I received this telegram from the governor of Louisiana. Sheriff Henderson Jordan, Arcadia, Louisiana. You are to be congratulated upon the capture of 2 of the most notorious outlaws in the Southwest. It is only by such diligence and action as you have shown that crime can be stamped out. O. K. Allen, Governor. A coroner's jury reported that afternoon that the outlaws had been killed by officers in the line of duty. During the night, the bodies were removed to Dallas by relatives. Mr. Darby, the undertaker, once a victim of the Bloody Barrows, assisted in the embalming. County officials from Fort Worth, Texas, requested permission to fire test shots from the 16-gauge shotgun found in Barrow's lap. The discharged cartridge cases were given to George Lacey, Houston, Texas ballistics expert. He compared the firing pin marks of the cartridge cases with those on discharged shells found at the scene of the murder of the 2 Texas highway patrolmen. The markings were identical. The test substantiated previous evidence that Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker had killed Patrolman Wheeler and Murphy the morning of Easter Sunday. At long last, with a heavy price in human life, the trail of the bloody Barrows had been brought to a conclusion. A few days after Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker had been buried, a Texas jury added what might be called an exclamation mark. Raymond Hamilton was sentenced to death in the electric chair for the murder of the prison farm guard. So, since Bonnie and Clyde died without a trial, they took Raymond Hamilton, who was facing a 360-something year sentence, and decided to put him to death instead. I'm not sure execution by proxy is necessarily the right thing to do, or actually I am sure that it's not the right thing to do, but moving on. The Doggerel Elegy, again, Doggerel is an amateurish poem. The Doggerel Elegy which follows was written by Bonnie Parker. It had been given to a Dallas newspaper with the understanding that it would not be published before her death. And so there you go. On a grave, no pun intended, sober, and very serious note, Bonnie and Clyde knew full well that there was only one way that their spree could end. And here is the elegy of Bonnie and Clyde, written by Bonnie Parker herself. You've read the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you still are in need of something to read, well, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow Gang, and I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal and how those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There are lots of untruths to their write-ups. They are not so merciless as that. They hate all the law, the stool pigeons, spotters, and rats. They class them as cold-blooded killers. They say they are heartless and mean. But I say this with pride that I once knew Clyde when he was honest and upright and clean. But the law fooled around, kept tracking him down and locking him up in a cell, till he said to me, I will never be free, so I will meet a few of them in hell. This road was so dimly lighted, there were no highway signs to guide. But they made up their minds if the roads were all blind, they wouldn't give up till they died. The road gets dimmer and dimmer. Sometimes you hardly can see. Still it's fight man to man and do all you can, for they know they can never be free. If they try to act like citizens and rent them a nice little flat, about the third night they're invited to fight by a machine gun rat-a-tat-tat. If a policeman is killed in Dallas and they have no clues for a guide, if they can't find a friend, they just wipe the slate clean and hang it on Bonnie and Clyde. 2 crimes have been done in America, not accredited to the Barrow mob, for they had no hand in the kidnapping demand of the Kansas City depot job. A newsboy once said to his buddy, I wish old Clyde would get jumped. In this awful hard times we might make a few extra dimes if 5 or 6 laws got bumped. The police haven't gotten a report yet. Clyde sent a wireless today, saying, we have a peace flag of white. We stretch out at night. We've joined the NRA. They don't think they're too tough or desperate. They know the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death was the wages of sin. From heartbreak, some people have suffered. From weariness, some people have died. But take it all in all, our troubles are small, till we get like Bonnie and Clyde. Someday they will go down together, and they will bury them side by side. To a few it means grief, to the law it's relief, but it's death to Bonnie and Clyde. You know, I don't know if it's fair to call this poem doggerel in its entirety. Sure, some of the stanzas could perhaps be a little bit more elegant, but man, there are a few in here that just rocked me. This one in particular. The road was so dimly lighted, there were no highway signs to guide, but they made up their minds if the roads were all blind that they wouldn't give up till they died. The road gets dimmer and dimmer. Sometimes you can hardly see. Still it's fight man to man and do all you can, for they know they can never be free. I mean, I don't think that's doggerel, man. I think that's just poetry. And in a last twisting of the knife for the notorious outlaws, Bonnie Parker's apparent desire to be buried beside Clyde Barrow, because the final line of the poem, someday they will go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To a few it means grief, to the law it's relief, but it's death to Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie's desire to be buried beside Clyde Barrow was denied. Their graves, in different cemeteries, are miles apart. Whew. Wow, what a story. Thank you so much for going on that journey with me. As I've said before, friendships are built when you spend quality time doing something you care about together. I hope this story was quality time for you. I hope it made you care. it certainly was quality time for me. Whew, and boy, it sure did make me care. Wow, what a killer couple. You know, I'd like to do now, as I do every week, tease you with what the episode coming on Thursday is, but I'm going to be honest, you guys, I have been so deep into the story of Bonnie and Clyde that I honestly have no idea what story I'm going to tell you on Thursday, September 15th. But hey, most of us love surprises, right? So if it's a surprise for me now, it'll be a surprise for you on Thursday the 15th. And all I can say is hopefully I've given you reason enough to trust me that it's going to be a story you enjoy and worth tuning in for. Thank you so much for spending the time with me, for going on this epic American journey of love and death and crime and violence and hatred and mystery and compulsion and familial duty and all of the things. Like, wow, absolutely epic as anything you could make up, and it's all true. Over the last 3 weeks, the last 7 episodes, you've just heard the entirety of Killer Couple, Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers. Leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.